we don't need the International Criminal Court telling us how to fight our wars. We don't need the European Union telling us how to run our economic or family life. We certainly do not need a monolithic, unelected, and unaccountable court telling us how to be a Jewish and democratic country. Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, actually a lot of thank yous have already been mentioned by Amiad, so I'll just skip it. But I want to thank Tikva Fund and Tikva Fund leadership for inviting me to join you on this day of such important thought and discussion for the American Jewish community. Looking out at this crowd of Jewish leaders who are so deeply committed to Jewish future, I want to speak with you about the most pressing issue determining the welfare of Israel and the Jewish people today. Judge Robert Bork once said about former Israeli Supreme Court Chief Justice Aaron Barak this: Barak's court can turn ordinary legislation into a constitution, force it on the nation, and then announce that it can prevent any democratic amendment. In this, Barak surely establishes a world record for judicial hubris. With great foresight, Bork referred to a danger that has only grown with time. The right of Jewish self-determination, embodied in the Zionist dream, is being trampled by the key institution which is meant to protect it. For many years now, the Israeli judiciary has willfully overreached its authority and engaged in the purposeful imposition of left-wing values on a more conservative Israeli society. The biggest conservative battle in Israel today is explaining this threat and offering positive alternatives for reform. You probably remember the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, right? The father there says, give me a word, any word, and I will show you that the root of this word is in Greek. So in paraphrase, give me a problem, any problem in the state of Israel today, and I will show you that the root of this problem is the court and the judicial activism. In fact, we can really talk about any pressing issue in Israel today. But the best example and the most urgent example of this culture clash is Jewish demographic in Israel. Maintaining Jewish majority is crucial to every element of life as we know it, from our national security to our education, to our democracy. Nonetheless, the growth of the non-Jewish population in Israel through immigration is greater than the growth of the Jewish population. In fact, the overall percentage of Jews in Israel is going down. Between 1992 and 2002, 140,000 Arabs from Judea and Samaria, mostly women, were granted residency in Israel under Israel's family reunification program. To give some context to this number, 65,000 Americans have made Aliyah in the past 20 years. 20 years, 65,000, half the time, more than double the number. This de facto Palestinian right of return radicalized Arab and Bedouin in Israel Galil, Negev, and mixed cities. You might remember the horrific riots last year in 2021. When Israeli intelligence services analyzed the identity of the perpetrators, children of marriage under the family reunification program were disproportionately more than double their share represented in the attackers. Israeli elected officials saw this problem in real time. In 2002, the Knesset has taken steps to tighten control on the family reunification program through legislation known as the citizenship law. But since 2002, the Knesset was forced by the court to modify and change the citizenship law so it will withstand judicial challenges. The outcome was a weak and ineffective law passed by weak and ineffective Knesset. On another Jewish majority issue, the illegal infiltrators from Africa, the court has canceled Knesset legislation 4 times in less than a decade. Israel faces many security challenges. We heard about some of them today. But these immigration problems would not have been among them but for the intervention of the court. The court's decisions are not rooted in law, but in their own value preferences. The court tends to view issues of non-Jewish immigration and even illegal immigration through a prism of equality that downplays the primacy of a Jewish majority in Israel. I am happy and proud to say that in the past year, I have led the Knesset from both sides of the aisle to enact a new citizenship law, declaring for the first time that its goal is to keep Israel's Jewish attributes. It was the first time since 2002 that the Knesset had fought back. Usually at this point in my talk, someone from the audience, especially if we are talking to American conservatives, will point out that perhaps the root of the clash is simply that Israel lacks a constitution to organize the proper balance of powers in Israeli government. But the constitutional question is less relevant to this issue for two reasons. The first is that parliamentarian supremacy, partially inherited from Britain, was foundational to the thinking of Israel's early leaders. The checks and balances already in place between the branches of Israeli government, and most especially the checks within the parliament, we need to create a strong coalition. If you follow the news in Israel, you know it's not such an easy task, right? Those checks and balances from within the system were considered sufficient limitation on parliamentarian supremacy, on parliamentarian power and supremacy. The court itself has also made the constitution question less relevant. Not only the Supreme Court unilaterally decided that Israel effectively already has a constitution, the court's power have ballooned to the point where it could easily decide the validity of any constitution or basic law we try to pass. Israel is the only country in the world that suddenly discovered its court adopted a constitution. Israel is the only country in the world that its Supreme Court senior members have a veto power over nominees to its bench. I knew it was a problem before I was a member of the Judicial Selection Committee. Now from within, it's worse. Israel is the only country in the world where the court's subject matter jurisdiction is unlimited. Israel is the only country in the world where the court lacks any limitation of standing or justiciability and can interpret laws as it sees fit despite the text of the law or the intention of the legislator. Israel is the only country in the world where the court can invalidate laws and even basic laws on basis of its own judicial doctrines. And it does so on a daily basis and on any issue you can imagine. I have devoted my life to explaining the dangers this imbalance poses to Israeli democracy, and certainly to Israel's Jewishness. In 2002, I founded Israel's only activist movement on this issue, the Israeli Movement for Governability and Democracy, also known as Meshilut. In 2019, I authored Mifleget Bagatz, or Supreme Rulers, a bestseller book showing how an activist Israeli Supreme Court poorly affected Israel's housing prices, the Jewish character of the state budget, and even parliamentarian procedures and outcome. In what I believe is perhaps the greatest leap forward for Israeli conservatism in recent years, I was a co-founder of the Tikva Funds, Israel's Law and Liberty Forum, which is educating a new generation of conservative Israeli legal leadership. We definitely need them. As American conservatives, I'm sure you will hear certain echoes of challenges you may be experiencing in the culture clash taking place in your schools or in the media. While the conservatives in each place differ from each other, even radically, the shared conservative struggle is fundamentally about who has the right to determine the national character, and all of the consequences that flow from that decision. In Israel, the most powerful actor in determining these questions today is not Israeli public, but its courts, unelected and unaccountable. A sovereign nation must have a government which is, as Lincoln said, of the people, by the people, and for the people. I represent the overwhelming majority of Israel when I say that we don't need the International Criminal Court telling us how to fight our wars. We don't need the European Union telling us how to run our economic or family life. We certainly do not need a monolithic, unelected, and unaccountable court telling us how to be a Jewish and democratic country. As I said, conservatives around the world differ in their policy preferences and priorities, but the threat of illiberal imperialism from unelected elites is essentially the same in Israel and in the US. Conservatives must stand strong against those common challenges. We will face and engage them with optimism and cheer. The need to fight for our homeland, for our families, for our ways of life signifies more than anything else the good that we have to fight for. Be'ezrat Hashem, the State of Israel will have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people of Israel. Toda rabah.